You're listening to Catholic Family Podcast.
You're listening to the Catholic Family Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Davis. I'm very happy to be back on the show. Yeah, we've had a bit of a reprieve, a little bit of a break here during the summer times. Everyone's busy. All of the priests have been at the Fatima conference or traveling here and there. I guess that's kind of how it is all the time. But I've managed to get in Father Borja and my dad kind of in between all of their work hours for a couple of hours here to discuss, I think, a topic that's really close to us all in many ways. I think it's something that we all enjoy talking about and enjoy listening to. I hope it's really, the conversation is about society and what has happened to our society. As we look around today, we see the world seems to be a bit of a mess, and not a bit of a mess, a lot of a mess. And the question is why? How has that happened? What has happened to the world in the last hundreds of years to bring us to this point? Now, obviously, we're not experts, we're not historians, but we're going to do our best to, give our own opinions on it, to have a bit of a chat and a discussion about what we think has happened from the Middle Ages at its peak and the slow decline of society in the world today from the Middle Ages down to now, where we see pretty much a complete ruling or a complete takeover by immorality, decadence, and tyranny. So, Father Borja, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you for having me, Kevin.
And Dad, you as well?
Yep, thank you, Kevin.
And so, Dad, I think, you kind of mentioned, I wanted to start really a two-part series and talk about the decline of society, starting with Martin Luther, being part one really being from Martin Luther into the 1960s, and then part two being 1960s until now. And you brought a good point where you wanted to more start it in the Middle Ages and say, okay, where was the peak and how did we fall? And so I'm going to throw it over to you first, and maybe you can help fill us in and get us started here talking about here in part one of this series, talking about the height of society in the Middle Ages.
Okay, sure, Kevin, and I appreciate you having me on. One of the things I've learned in my study, and I'm not exactly a historian, but I mean I've studied some history, and what you learn is that basically the two-dimensional, the cardboard cutout, soundbite-oriented history that we learn is typically written by winners of wars, and so you have this narrative that gets crafted. In our case, I think for the last 100 years or so, most of the wars have been won by communists. And so you have, communists, global bankers, whatever you want to call them, have been kind of writing our history. And so it colors a lot of what we believe. So I think what I wanted to do is kind of take a little bit of a deeper dive into some real history, because, what a lot of what we see in a two-dimensional sense is just, I don't think it's true. So basically, okay, so going all the way back to the birth of the church and the first 300 or 400 years under the Romans, the Roman Empire fell in the early 400s. And after that, you kind of had a void in terms of large government oversight. And what replaced it was basically a society that was very localized. And you had Christianity coming out of the catacombs and out into the public, and basically making its full saturation into the way things worked. And it's often portrayed in our world today as the Dark Ages. If you ever watch a movie about this time, you'll notice like the sun never shines, right? And it's portrayed as being these dark, awful type times. But the reality is, in these times, this was the birth of art as we know it today, of architecture that has not been replicated since, of universities, of medicine, of all these different things. And so in music, like you had you had a piece on the devolution of music, and really looked at the Middle Ages as being the height of music, because it was all centered on God. And I think that's what we had during the Middle Ages. It was this beautiful time when men's thoughts were more fixed on God. And to get, especially if you're like a serf, your regular day-to-day life was difficult. It was hard, but at the same time, you had that proper focus on the divine, on what was true. And for me, at least, that period started basically in the early 400s and ended with Luther. That to me was the peak of humanity in the Christian age.
Yeah, and it is exactly as you say. It is so funny. It's so obvious. We should see the propaganda and how they paint literally in black and white. Exactly as you say, if you watch these movies based in the Dark Ages, first of all, you see it like in a dark colors, the sun never shines, and the Catholic Church is always the bad guy, right? Always, no matter the story, the Catholic Church is the bad guy. They're the ones who are oppressing people and they're beating people down and they're holding people with their head in the dirt. And it's pretty incredible, as we see in our modern times, what the media does. They literally turn things upside down and turn truths into lies and lies into truth.
Right. If you look at the birth of universities, I just learned this recently that universities originated as basically in cathedrals of larger cities, and they were houses of learning for the clergy, where they could learn their faith better. Okay, and so you had these universities begin, and eventually, I think it was Pope Clement, one of the popes, had recognized 4 or 5 of these universities and said that if you have if you become a master, you become a doctor at one of these universities, you could teach at a different university. It was basically the church recognized these educational, became turned into diplomas. These were the first diplomas that we had in university, and this all came from the Catholic Church. And so, this was a really beautiful time of progress for mankind. And even you or maybe Father can talk a little bit more about the spiritual aspect of where men's hearts were at these times compared to where they are today.
And yeah, I would just add to that. I think the great medieval Gothic cathedrals that we see in Europe are just a testament of man's strong faith at the time. You just have these incredible churches that were built, and I remember showing my students a documentary once on these great cathedrals, these there in Europe, and you just have, it baffles even people today. Like, how is it that they were able to build these beautiful, impressive buildings with limited technology, and it's not the same technology we have today, and yet they were able to build these beautiful churches, which were a testament to their strong Catholic faith
and their strength as a society. And society is, obviously, we all know, is built from the people, right? It's built from the families, especially. And imagine these workers who are building these cathedrals, they're so, if you go into St. Peter's in Rome, your brain almost can't comprehend it. It's truly that magnificent, that glorious, that big. And if you imagine, these were built, much of it was built by normal people. Okay, maybe not St. Peter's, but if you go out in the countryside here in Bavaria, these churches were built by the parishioners. So these were people who were spending their days working their own fields or whatnot, and then going and spending the rest of their evening or afternoons or whatever time, or at least a lot of it, giving it to the church. And so, as Father says, it's a true testament not only to their faith, but to the culture. To everything was based around God and giving to the church and stuff. And I don't know, Dad, if you're going to talk about the social structure, but I think that's amazingly fascinating with your feudal monarchical times.
Right. So basically, the structure, you had cities that were starting to develop at the time, but for the most part, most people lived in this feudal type system. So a king or a duke or it's somebody who was at the top would have a castle that they would have. They would own, basically, for the most part, as far as the eye could see. That was the most common thing. And around them, they had basically serfs. They had workmen. They had a military, and it was the job of the local, they'll call him the king, the local king, to provide a church, to provide medical facilities, to provide protection all these different things, and in return, the serfs then gave part of their goods, or what they produced, to the king as basically a form of tax. But it was very local. And for the most part, what I think was beautiful about these times, and this is ironically, this is what modern man hates about it. If you were a serf, if you were a workman, if you were nobility, you basically, that was it for life. You did not have anything resembling social, the ability to move between social mobility between social classes. And so you accepted the fact that if you were a serf, you were going to always be a serf. But in a sense, I mean, it's offensive to modern man, but really, I think it provided a certain degree of just relief in terms of being able to know that you're going to go through life, but you are living for the next life. And also, if you were nobility and you were truly Catholic, you knew that the gate for you to get into heaven was narrow because you were rich. And you had to make sure, I think, that you didn't live as a rich, but you might have had money, but you had to not live as a rich person. You had to take care of your servants, take care of your military, take care, or, you know, you would lose your soul, but you would also probably eventually lose your kingdom.
Yeah, and I've got two points on that. That's such a crazy important topic. I think the one point you make is that they didn't have the ability to move up or down, really, and I think that's truly something that we underappreciate in our time, or we overappreciate the ability to choose. I think that's one of the greatest issues of our age, is that we have too many choices. And I see it all the time with people I know and people, you know, I meet, that they don't pick a path in life. They don't pick a career. They don't pick a schooling. They don't pick a wife or a husband, because there's too many choices. There's too many options, especially with the internet. They think, I can always do better. I could always do something different. Maybe I studied for 4 years, but I don't love it, so I'm going to study some more. And I think it's really an epidemic of too many choices. And as you say, back in the day, hey, my father was a blacksmith, so I'm going to be a blacksmith. And you know what? Most people were totally fine with that, because it's work. You work because that's how you can live. You know, you don't live to work. And it's so true, and it's so important. My second point was that, as you say, the kings were kind of the heads of this feudal system. But oftentimes it was the abbots. So you had huge monasteries. You had the monasteries and the abbots that were in charge of these huge swaths of land and the people. And so you really had this social system that worked directly through the church. And so the people would give their tithes and their alms to the church. The church would take care of the sick. They would take care of the poor, of the elderly, and all these different things that in today's society, we think, well, you know, who takes care of them now? And again, it's so underappreciated. And so people look at the past, they think the church was a bad guy. And medieval culture and society was practically run through the church, and it ran very, very well.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, this is probably getting ahead a little bit in the game, and I think we'll get to this as we talk about the current days. But I mean, how much of our stress today is caused by, you know, like you say, the choices we have to make, and should I change careers? Should I move houses? Should I, you know, do this or do that? And we have so much of that. What TV show should I watch? I mean, there's so much that I think that does give us, I mean, it kind of throws us off kilter a certain amount as people.
And yeah. I would say that it distracts us. It keeps us, you know, you have all these things, we're bombarded left and right, and it just keeps us, it can keep us distracted from focusing on what we need to focus on.
Absolutely, which is of course God, right? I mean, and that's exactly right. I mean, and God and furthering ourselves as people and trying to just be better people and better to others, et cetera. And especially with our phones and technology. Again, we'll get onto that, I guess, as we move on. But it's a good comparison, because I think it's really important to show that was one of the key. It's one of the key things that people frown upon now, that there was this inequality, and I don't think people quite understand inequality. And it's because, as Dad says, our history has been written by communists. And communists, of course, they don't want people to think it's okay to be a blacksmith or whatnot. And I think we do need to say too that when you're regarding the Middle Ages, of course there were bad people, there were bad times, there were bad kings, there were, it was not perfect, and I think that should go without saying, but I guess I should say that anyway. And if you look at the Crusades, which I want to do a show on, by the way, I got to plug 2 future shows. Actually, I want to do a show on the Crusades with my brother William, who's studying the topic right now, and I want to do a show with my friend Christian, who is a German over here, and he's an historian, and he actually has studied. He did his master's degree on medieval Munich, so the city Munich in the medieval times, and actually specifically on how a hospital was specifically run to the detail in the medieval times, I think in the 1400s, which I think is absolutely brilliant. And so I'm really excited to have him on, hopefully in the next few weeks too, to talk about this subject in real detail, where he can truly say what was the real life around Munich during the Middle Ages. But again, people weren't perfect. It was not this utopia. But as we see with the things that have lasted, look at it this way. Gregorian chant, of course, I guess doesn't necessarily survive in pop culture, but it's there. You'll hear it even in movies. Sometimes you'll hear actually Gregorian chant. Can you imagine some song from who's a pop artist now, Britney Spears or something? Can you imagine that 1,000 years from now? You think that's going to last? Of course it's not. Can you imagine that the buildings that we're all sitting in, maybe me in Bavaria, it might last, but most buildings, especially in the US, I think you guys would agree, are they going to last past 100 years tops? They're not. And I think that it's such a sign to show that we think we're so smart, we think we're so progressed, but we're not. And that's literally just in terms of temporal things, not even speaking of the spiritual side.
And just going to add, I believe it was Father Cicada. He did some comparisons with Gregorian chant and modern day music, and he was saying that I think in many of the movies and modern music, you have like refrains from the Dies Irae. Do you remember something to that effect? Yeah, which I thought was very interesting.
Wow.
And the music topic, I think, is brilliant because it's something that I did a show on too. You can go back and look at on the YouTube channel, The Devolution of Music, which I think Matthew Arthur down in Australia did a great job of studying that. And I think it's really, really fascinating to see how it devolved and how it kind of came down and how the peak of it was in the Middle Ages, in the early Middle Ages with a true Gregorian chant, which I think kind of peaked with Palestrina, but it kind of depends on your taste, good and bad. Gregorian, Palestrina, heights and then kind of lows. I mean, but Palestrina is another brilliant story because he kind of saved it from going too far because they were about to ban it, but his mass was so beautiful that they kept it in. Anyway, whole nother topic. Sorry to go off on a little music tangent. That's for another podcast, I suppose.
Well, and Kevin, one of the other points I think is going to be important as we go through this topic is one of the other things that was really unquestioned for the most part during the Middle Ages, especially was that of authority. You knew as a Catholic that authority derived from God Himself, came down through the Pope, through the bishops, through the clergy, and then to the laity. And I mean, yeah, you had heretics, you had schismatics, you had people who didn't acknowledge that authority, but you had this beautiful order in terms of basically as a world, as a Western world, as a Christian world, we knew that authority structure was in place, it was legitimate. And I feel like as we started to get into more modern times, that's kind of what started to get undermined.
Right. Yeah, totally. Right. Exactly. Especially when you start looking at Luther and everything he did. I mean, if you study that at all, you see that's in a way, it's also in a way, it was the authority trying to take advantage of the church being gone. So I should say the secular authority. So back in the day, too, in the Middle Ages, there was a huge respect for the secular authority as well. They believed that the kingly right to rule also came from God. And so that's a topic we also talked about in another podcast, is the authority in our responsibility to follow our earthly authority, even if we don't like it. People back in the Middle Ages, that their kings, even if they didn't like them, they would call them to war. That was another thing about being a serf, was that you had to pay your tax. And if the king said, hey, go get your shovel, we're going to go fight Duke so-and-so over around the corner, you had to go, because that was just part of your duty. And it was part of the life of living under that king. Now, even if you didn't like it, you had to do it because you respected the authority, and perhaps, they'd hang you from the castle wall if you didn't listen to it. But it is a really interesting topic, and especially, as you say, the authority of the church. And boy, do we see that now. Again, another topic for a podcast that's coming up in the next weeks is the lack of respect for the papacy and for the church, which we see rampant in today's world, where the Pius X people and the people who are the recognize and resist don't understand that you can't say there is an authority in Rome, but not listen to them and then make fun of them and all these different things, which again, that's something I'm going to talk about in a podcast in the coming weeks. So I'm hoping that everyone listening to this is going to be like, wow, these are some really cool topics that Kevin's bringing up here, so that it will keep people tuned in the future. And I should also say that while you're listening to this, please like, comment, subscribe, do all those things, share it on Facebook and Twitter, all these different things with your family and friends. Obviously, we don't make any money here, but Father and my dad are spending their valuable time to try to talk about good, valuable topics. And that's what we're trying to do, is spread good culture, good media. And so please like, share, subscribe, comment, all those things. It does help us out. And moving on. Dad, do you have what else do we want to talk about the Middle Ages? I mean, I think, as you say, it's the peak of culture in many ways. But I mean, is that was it the peak, Father? Would you say, was it the peak of the church in terms of? It's hard to say. I know that's an unfair question, but do you get my question? Kind of. What was there a peak of the church's earthly? I don't know. That's a really hard question to form.
It is, but I think that, I mean, you see, I think I would say that was the period where you have the more. As I mentioned earlier, just the churches that were being built and that came about. I think that was the period where that was kind of the peak of I would say Catholic architecture in regards to the churches and to the beauty that went into making these churches, and just everything that helped man lift their minds and their hearts to God. And that was, like I said, just that reflection of their faith. And so I guess it is kind of a hard question, but I would say that it's probably a time where it reached its fullness, so to say, in the aspect of externally with these church buildings, etc.
Right, because obviously the church as the bride of Christ never is more or less, but I guess you can only judge it by exactly, as you say, by what we see. And I guess if a lot of your proselytizing for the Catholic Church was done that's a good place. I don't know, Dad, do you have anything further to say? I mean, do we want to talk about more about the height, or do we want to start going in the decrescendo?
Yeah, I think that I think we've set the scene here. I felt like in order to really understand how we've digressed or how we've devolved in so many ways since then, I think you kind of have to understand what height we fell from, and I'm hoping that this has provided some insight there.
Totally, and I think in the next shows we're going to show it'll make even more sense as maybe we compare some of the humanist artists, like Da Vinci, or not Da Vinci, the Sistine Chapel.
Michelangelo.
Yeah, Michelangelo. Thank you, Father. And all these different issues where you start to see in this time around Luther, when the church was kind of in a mess, honestly, in its worldly sense. Obviously, that you had some bad popes, you had some issues going on, and you can see, like today's time and like the 1960s, exactly why these issues started to affect the world. I mean, when the church is being infiltrated and being, run amok a bit from the inside, that the world kind of follows suit. And we're seeing that now, obviously, and have been for the last 70 years, as they did in the 1500s, and as they have, I guess, a few other times through history. And that's what we want to talk about in the upcoming episodes. And so, again, this episode, a little bit of a brief introduction, talking about the Middle Ages, the height of Christendom, of Catholic culture in many ways. Just look at the churches, listen to Gregorian music, compare it to the building you're sitting in right now. Go listen to Gregorian chant and then plug in some Billie Eilish or some pop music and compare them. Just tell me which one is going to last, which one is more importantly for God and godly, and you'll know very, very quickly. We're going to go into part 2. where we're going to talk about the decline of the world or Western civilization from Luther until the 1960s and the Second Vatican Council. So thanks for listening to part 1. We'll be back shortly with part 2 of this series. Thanks for listening.